You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Useless information.
Hi, I'm Steve Silverman, and you're listening to a classic episode of the Useless Information Podcast. The story you're about to hear, the Shiloh Church Disaster, was first released on February 9th, 2008, and I have to tell you that's during the Stone Age of podcasting. Anyway, the story was first written for my Useless Information website in the late 1990s, and then I included it in my second book, Lindbergh's Artificial Heart. So let's take a listen.
Welcome to the Useless Information Podcast, my collection of fascinating true stories from the flip side history. My name is Steve Silverman, and today's story is on the Shiloh Baptist Church Disaster of 1902. And it's a story of why you should never scream fight in a crowded room. Now, before we discuss that story, let's talk about today's question of the day. My question for you today is one that's fairly straightforward. What is the difference between a meteor, a meteoroid with OID at the end, and a meteorite with ITE at the end? Again, what is the difference between a meteor, a meteoroid, and a meteorite? And I'll let you know the answer at the end of this podcast. And now for today's story on the Shiloh Baptist Church Disaster. Now, I'm sure you've been told many times in your life that you should never, ever, under any circumstance, scream fire in a crowded room. You could start a panic, and of course, many people could get hurt or even killed. But I'm here to tell you today that you should also never scream fight, the word fight, in a crowded room, because someone could misunderstand you and also create a panic. And if someone asks you for proof, all you need to do is point to the story of the Shiloh Baptist Church Disaster, which occurred on September 19th, 1902 in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, the church was packed on this day. There were more than 2,000 people there, and they had gathered for the National Convention of Negro Baptists to hear the famous Booker T. Washington give the opening address. Now, just as he had finished, a Baltimore lawyer named Judge Ballou started an argument with the church's choir leader over an unoccupied seat. That's it. Well, one of the choir members decided to scream fight to the crowd, but unfortunately the crowd misinterpreted it as fire, and you can see where this story is going. Now, this is in a time when the fire laws were not very strict. You didn't need to have a lot of exits out of buildings to ensure that people would get out safely. So the entire congregation, at least it seemed at one time, picked up and ran to the rear door of the church. There's a double door, and they all try to fit through it at one time. And you know that just can't be done. You can't get 2,000 people through the door at the same time. One of the ministers went to the rostrum and pleaded for quiet, but it only made the situation worse. People didn't hear him properly, and they just wanted out of the building. Now, the church was about 15 feet above street level, and it had a long set of stairs that dropped down to the sidewalk, and on either side of the staircase were two large, tall brick walls. As people came out of the church and tried to descend the steps, the force of the crowd behind them actually knocked them over. And then more people would pile on top, and more and more and more people, until in the end, 115 people, mostly women, had lost their lives. And of course, many others were injured. So the next time that someone screams fight in a crowded room, make sure you tell them the story of the Shiloh Church Disaster of 1902. I bet you they won't do it again. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. And now the answer to today's question of the day, which was, what is the difference between a meteor, a meteoroid, and a meteorite? Now, a meteoroid is simply a chunk of rock that's in orbit around the sun. It can do that for millions, if not billions of years, keep going round and round and round the sun. As long as it's doing that, it's called a meteoroid. But at some point, it may get pulled in by the Earth's gravitational field, and then as it's passing through our atmosphere, a streak of light will be produced. When that is happening, it is now referred to as a meteor. It's actually streaking through the sky, and it's a meteor. And finally, when it lands on the ground, if anything remains, and it lands on the ground, the chunk of rock left behind is known as a meteorite. So a meteoroid is while it's in orbit around the sun, a meteor is as it's streaking through our atmosphere, and finally a meteorite is when it actually hits the ground. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's story on the Shiloh Baptist Church Disaster of 1902, or why you should never scream fight in a crowded room. If you'd like to read more true stories just like this, please be sure to get a copy of one of my books. They are Einstein's Refrigerator and Other Stories from the Flip Side History, and Lindbergh's Artificial Heart, more fascinating true stories from Einstein's Refrigerator, both written by me, Steve Silverman, and they're available from your local bookseller, online retailers, and of course through your local library. If you'd like to contact me for any reason, simply drop me an email at useless@steve.silverman.name. That's useless@steve.silverman.name. You can also go to my website at uselessinformation.org. That's uselessinformation.org. Thanks again for listening.